Imagine the rain pouring through a leaky thatched roof, dripping steadily onto your straw bed, and knowing there's nothing you can do about it. Tonight, we step back into the soaked boots of medieval peasants, those who faced the rainy season. With no money, no tools, and no mercy from the sky, how did they keep dry? What did they do when their homes turned into muddy puddles? Let's uncover the surprisingly clever and oddly cozy ways these resilient souls braved the storms. If the strange survival tricks of forgotten times help you drift into deeper sleep, you're exactly where you need to be. Dust. Subscribe and tap the bell icon so these rainy, rattling, and restful stories can find you night after night. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You might imagine that the winter of 1363 began like any other in the small village of Wickham, nestled in the rolling hills of what we now call Hampshire. But you would be mistaken. By late September, when the harvest should have been safely gathered and the last of the apple crop stored away, an unusual chill had already settled over the English countryside. The peasants who worked the manor lands could feel it in their bones. This winter would be different, though none could have predicted just how brutal it would become. The first indication came not from the sky, but from the behavior of the animals. Old Edmund, who had tended the Lord's sheep for more than 40 winters, noticed how the woolly creatures huddled closer together than usual, their breath visible in the morning air, even before the sun had fully risen. The sparrows, too, seemed different, gathering in larger flocks, pecking frantically at the remaining seeds in the stubbled fields, as if they sensed what was coming. These were the subtle signs that experienced countryfolk learned to read, passed down through generations of ancestors who had survived by paying attention to such details. In the cottage of Agnes and her husband William, a copyholder who farmed 12 acres of the Lord's demesne, the preparation for winter had begun earlier than usual. Their home, typical of peasant dwellings in 14th century England, consisted of a single room roughly 20 feet by 12 feet, with walls of wattle and daub construction. The framework of the house was built from oak timbers, locally sourced from the village woodlands. Between these sturdy posts a lattice of hazel and willow branches had been woven, the wattle, and over this framework a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and animal hair had been plastered to form the daub. The roof of Agnes and William's cottage was made of thatch, bundles of wheat straw laid in carefully overlapping courses and secured to wooden rafters with twisted straw rope. When new, such a roof could last 20 to 30 years, shedding water effectively and providing excellent insulation. But their roof was not new. It had been patched and repatched over the past 15 years, with newer straw laid over older layers that had grown thin and brittle. In places, you could see where previous repairs had been made, darker patches where different types of straw had been used, or where bundles had been tied with hemp rope instead of the traditional straw binding. Agnes had noticed the problem. Areas during the wet autumn months. There was a spot above their sleeping area where water would drip steadily during heavy rains, falling into a wooden bowl that she positioned on the packed earth floor. Another leak had developed near the door, where the thatch met the wall. Here, the constant moisture had begun to rot the wooden plate that supported the roof, and Agnes could see daylight through a gap that seemed to grow larger each week. But repairs to the roof were not simply a matter of laying new straw. The work required specific skills and, more importantly, materials that were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. The wheat straw needed for thatching had to be of the right type, long-stemmed and harvested at precisely the right time. It needed to be cut with a sickle rather than a scythe, leaving the stems unbroken and strong enough to shed water properly. Much of this year's wheat straw had already been used for animal bedding or ground up for fodder, and what remained was often too short or damaged to be suitable for roofing. The work of thatching also required knowledge that not every peasant possessed. While William was skilled at agricultural work and could repair wooden tools or mend fences, the intricate layering technique needed for proper thatching was a specialized craft. In larger villages, there might be a dedicated thatcher, a craftsman who traveled from farm to farm during the autumn months, repairing roofs before the harsh weather set in. But Wickham was a small settlement, and their nearest skilled thatcher lived 2 days' walk away in Winchester. Even if they could have afforded to hire a professional thatcher, which they could not, the cost was prohibitive for a family that lived on the edge of subsistence. A full rethatching could cost more than a peasant family earned in several months, requiring not only payment for the craftsman's time, but also the purchase of materials. Most peasant families made do with what they could manage themselves, patching holes with whatever materials they could find, and hoping their repairs would hold through another season. As October progressed and the temperatures continued to drop, Agnes and William attempted their own modest repairs. They gathered armfuls of long grass from the meadows, binding them into small bundles that they used to plug the most obvious gaps. Where the thatch had blown away completely, they laid salvaged pieces of wood, broken barrel staves, old fence posts, even flat stones, to create temporary barriers against the weather. These makeshift patches were far from waterproof, but they at least reduced the most direct exposure to wind and rain. The couple also began preparing the interior of their home for the long months ahead. They gathered dried bracken and heather from the common lands, spreading thick layers on the floor to provide insulation against the cold earth beneath. Around the central hearth, they arranged stones in a circle to better contain the heat from their fire and reflect warmth back into the room. Agnes collected moss and stuffed it into the gaps in the walls where the daub had cracked or fallen away, creating additional barriers against drafts. But despite their efforts, both Agnes and William knew that their preparations were inadequate for what was coming. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who had lived through previous harsh winters. The holly trees were heavy with berries, the squirrels were gathering nuts with unusual urgency, and the evening sky had taken on that peculiar grey-white color that old people said predicted snow. The very air itself seemed to carry a different quality, a sharp edge that caught in the throat and made breathing visible even on relatively mild days. On the feast day of All Saints, November 1st, the first serious storm of the winter arrived. It began as a gentle rain in the early morning hours, the kind of steady precipitation that soaks slowly into the ground and fills the streams. But by midday, the wind had picked up, driving the rain horizontally across the fields and finding every weakness in the village's weathering defenses. Agnes watched from her doorway as neighbors scurried between buildings, hunched against the weather, carrying bundles of firewood or herding livestock into whatever shelter they could provide. Inside her cottage, the familiar sounds of the dripping had returned. The wooden bowl positioned beneath the main leak quickly filled and had to be emptied repeatedly. But now there were new sounds as well, a steady pattering near the door where their emergency repair had failed, and an ominous creaking from the roof timbers as the wind tested the aging structure. William climbed up on a stool to examine the ceiling more closely, running his hands along the rafters to check for new movement or settling. What he found was not encouraging. The wooden poles that supported the thatch were wet to the touch, indicating that water was penetrating the roof, covering more extensively than they had realized. In several places, he could feel soft spots in the wood where rot was beginning to take hold. Most worrying of all, there was a section near the center of the room where the roof sagged noticeably, suggesting that the supporting structure was beginning to fail under the combined weight of old thatch, accumulated moisture, and the pressure of the wind. Agnes and William spent that night listening to their home, fighting against the elements. Every gust of wind brought new sounds, the rattling of loose thatch, the creaking of timber, the splash of water finding new paths through their defenses. They moved their sleeping pallets away from the areas where leaks were most severe, huddling close to the fire and pulling their woolen blankets tight around their shoulders. But sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the need to empty containers that collected the endless dripping, and by the constant worry about whether their shelter would hold through the night. What mysteries lay ahead in the darker months of winter? How would they survive when this was only the beginning and the worst cold of the Little Ice Age had yet to arrive? The storm that had battered Wickham on All Saints' Day proved to be merely a herald of what was to come. As November progressed, the weather grew increasingly severe, with temperatures dropping far below what even the oldest villagers could remember from their youth. By the feast of St. Martin, November 11th, the ground had frozen solid, and a thin layer of ice covered the village pond each morning, though it still melted during the warmer afternoon hours. Agnes and William's cottage had survived the first storm, but the damage had been more extensive than they initially realized. The morning after the wind had died down, William climbed onto their roof to assess the situation more thoroughly. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Several of the wooden pegs that held the thatch bundles in place had worked loose, and entire sections of the roof covering had shifted or blown away completely. In the dim light filtering through gaps in the clouds, he could see that their home was far from the only one in the village showing signs of distress. Nearly every cottage along the muddy lane that served as Wickham's main thoroughfare showed evidence of storm damage. Loose thatch hung from roof lines like disheveled hair. Wooden shutters had been torn from their hinges, and in several places entire sections of wall had collapsed, where the combination of wind and water had undermined the wattle and daub construction. The village's small church, built of stone and therefore more durable than the peasant dwellings, had lost several roof tiles, and the priest could be seen each morning sweeping rainwater from the nave with a worn broom. For Agnes and William, the immediate challenge was not just repairing their roof, but surviving the nights when temperatures now regularly dropped below freezing. The gaps in their thatch meant that their cottage no longer retained heat effectively, and the wooden bowl that had previously been sufficient to catch the dripping now had to be accompanied by several additional containers as new leaks appeared, almost daily. Their first adaptation was to create what amounted to a house within a house. Using their few pieces of furniture, a wooden chest, 2 three-legged stools, and a rough table made from planks laid across trestles, they constructed a barrier around their sleeping area. Over this framework, they draped every piece of cloth. They owned their second-best woolen blanket, Agnes's spare kirtle, William's winter cloak, and even the canvas sack that normally held their grain. This improvised tent-like structure, positioned close to the hearth, created a smaller space that could be heated more effectively with their limited supply of fuel. The problem of fuel was becoming increasingly critical as the weather worsened. Like most peasant families, Agnes and William depended primarily on wood for heating and cooking, supplemented by whatever else they could burn: dried animal dung, crop stubble, and bundles of twigs gathered from the hedgerows. But wood had to be kept dry to burn properly, and their normal storage area, a lean-to structure attached to the side of their cottage, provided little protection from the driving rain that seemed to come from every direction. William spent his days during this period in a constant search for combustible materials that could supplement their dwindling wood supply. He learned to identify which types of dried vegetation would burn despite being slightly damp, and he became expert at coaxing a flame from materials that a few months earlier he would have considered useless. Dried bracken could be twisted into tight bundles that would burn hot and fast, providing quick warmth for cooking. The stems of harvested grain, if properly dried, could be woven into compact bundles that burned more slowly and provided steady heat for warming the cottage. Agnes, meanwhile, developed techniques for managing the increasingly complex task of keeping their living space dry and livable. She discovered that certain types of clay, when mixed with ash from their fire, created a paste that could be used to temporarily seal the worst gaps in their walls. She learned to position containers not just to catch dripping water, but to channel it away from their sleeping area and toward the door where it could eventually be swept outside. The couple also had to adapt their daily routines to the reality of living in a space that was no longer fully weatherproof. Cooking, which had previously been done over the central hearth at any time of day, now had to be carefully scheduled to coincide with the times when their improvised shelter was warmest and driest. Agnes would wait until the fire had been burning for several hours before attempting to prepare their main meal, and she learned to cook larger quantities at once so that food could be reheated later rather than requiring fresh cooking throughout the day. Their diet during this period reflected both the seasonal limitations of a peasant household and the additional constraints imposed by their housing difficulties. The majority of their meals consisted of pottage, a thick porridge made from whatever grains and vegetables were available. Oats, when they could afford them, provided a filling base for this dish, but more often Agnes had to make do with barley mixed with dried peas and beans. To this basic mixture, she would add whatever other ingredients were at hand: turnips and parsnips from their small garden plot, herbs dried from the previous summer, and occasionally small amounts of salted pork or bacon when their finances allowed. The preparation of pottage was particularly challenging in their damaged cottage because it required long, slow cooking over a steady fire. Agnes learned to start the cooking process early in the morning when the coals from the previous night's fire were still warm, adding ingredients gradually throughout the day as the mixture simmered. The pot itself, a large iron cauldron that was one of their most valuable possessions, had to be carefully positioned to avoid the areas where water dripped from the ceiling, and Agnes became skilled at moving it around the hearth as the wind direction changed and altered the pattern of leaks. As December approached and the cold intensified further, Agnes and William were forced to make increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation. Their supply of grain, which should have lasted through the winter, was being consumed more quickly than usual because the cold weather increased their caloric needs. At the same time, their supply of fuel was being depleted rapidly because their damaged roof meant they needed to maintain a larger fire for longer periods to achieve the same warming effect. The social fabric of the village began to show the strain of these conditions as well. Families that had traditionally helped one another during difficult periods found themselves with fewer resources to share. The village's small supply of surplus grain, normally maintained by the lord of the manor for distribution during times of need, had been partially ruined by water damage to the storage buildings. The priest, who typically served as a coordinator for charitable assistance, was overwhelmed by the number of families seeking help. Yet it was also during this period that Agnes and William witnessed remarkable examples of human ingenuity and cooperation. Their neighbour, an elderly woman named Maud, who lived alone in a cottage even more dilapidated than their own, had developed a system for warming stones in her fire during the day and then wrapping them in rags to provide heat for her bed at night. She shared this technique with other villagers, and soon the practice spread throughout Wickham. Another neighbour, a young man named Robert, who had some experience working with leather, showed William how to waterproof cloth using a mixture of beeswax and tallow. This technique allowed them to create more effective coverings for their improvised shelter, and Robert helped several families in the village treat their blankets and cloaks to provide better protection against moisture. The knowledge that sustained Agnes and William through these difficult weeks was largely traditional, passed down through generations of ancestors who had faced similar challenges. Agnes's mother had taught her to recognize the signs of grain spoilage and to stretch food supplies by adding wild plants and roots to their diet. William's father had shown him how to bank a fire so that coals would remain alive through the night, providing a quick source of heat and flame for the following morning. But they were also forced to innovate, developing new techniques born of their specific circumstances. Agnes learned to use the water that dripped through their roof, collecting it in clean containers and using it for cooking and washing rather than allowing it to simply puddle on their floor. William discovered that certain combinations of materials, layers of straw, alternated with layers of bracken and topped with pieces of old cloth, provided better insulation than any single material used alone. By the end of December, their cottage bore little resemblance to the snug dwelling they had inhabited just a few months earlier. The interior was divided into distinct zones, a warm, relatively dry area immediately around the hearth where they spent most of their time, a damp but protected sleeping space enclosed by their improvised barriers, and a cold, wet area near the door where they stored items that could tolerate moisture. The earthen floor, once smooth and level, now showed permanent dips and channels where repeated flooding had worn away the packed surface. Yet, despite these harsh conditions, Agnes and William had survived the deepening winter, and their techniques for managing their deteriorating shelter had evolved into a complex but effective system. As the year drew to a close and the promise of even colder weather loomed ahead, they faced an uncertain future. Would their innovations be sufficient to carry them through what promised to be the harshest months of this little ice age, winter? The first week of January 1364 brought weather that would be remembered in the annals of English village life for generations to come. When Agnes awoke on the morning of January the 6th, the feast of Epiphany, she found that the water in the bowl beside her sleeping pallet had frozen solid overnight. Not just a thin film of ice that would melt with the warmth of her breath, but a solid mass that rang like metal when she tapped it with her wooden spoon. Outside, the world had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The temperature had dropped so precipitously that even the Thames, many miles to the north, would eventually freeze solid enough to support horses and carts crossing its surface. But here in Wickham, the immediate effects were more intimately felt. The mud lanes that connected the village cottages had become treacherous paths of frozen ruts and hidden ice patches. The village well, which had provided water for the community for as long as anyone could remember, now yielded only chips of ice that had to be melted before they could serve any useful purpose. Inside Agnes and William's cottage, the effects of this extreme cold created new challenges that tested the limits of their adaptive abilities. The gaps in their roof, which had previously admitted rain and wind, now allowed something far more insidious, the kind of cold that seemed to settle into every corner and crevice, creating drafts that could extinguish candles and make even the area immediately around their fire uncomfortably chill. But perhaps most significantly, this intense cold revealed the true ingenuity that ordinary people could develop when faced with extraordinary circumstances. Agnes and William's response to these conditions demonstrated the remarkable resourcefulness that allowed medieval peasants to survive in environments that would challenge even modern survival experts. Their first discovery was that their improvised, tent-like shelter around the sleeping area was not merely a convenience, but an essential survival technique. The smaller enclosed space could be warmed more efficiently, but they learned that its effectiveness depended on careful attention to details that had not been immediately obvious. The height of the enclosure mattered enormously. Too tall, and warm air would rise and escape. Too low, and there would not be enough space for comfortable sleeping. Through trial and error, they determined that the optimal height was just enough for them to sit upright while inside. The positioning of their fire became a matter of precise calculation. Too close to their sleeping enclosure, and they risked setting fire to the cloth barriers. Too far away, and the heat would dissipate before reaching them. William discovered that the optimal distance was approximately 6 feet, and that the fire performed best when it was built in a specific configuration. Larger logs at the back to provide sustained heat, smaller pieces at the front that could be fed regularly throughout the night, and a carefully constructed arrangement of stones around the perimeter that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly after dark. Agnes developed an elaborate system for managing the water that continued to drip through their roof, even as temperatures plummeted. She learned that if she positioned containers at slight angles, the water would freeze in thin layers that could be easily removed, preventing the bowls from cracking as ice expanded. More importantly, she discovered that this ice, when carefully collected and stored, provided a cleaner source of water than what they could obtain from the village well during these bitter months. The question of food became increasingly complex as the winter deepened. Their stores of grain and preserved meat, which should have been adequate for a normal winter, were being consumed more rapidly because their bodies required additional calories to maintain warmth in their poorly heated shelter. But Agnes learned to compensate by developing new techniques for extracting maximum nutrition from limited ingredients. She discovered that bones from their occasional meat meals could be roasted until they were nearly black, then ground up and added to their pottage to provide additional substance and nutrition. Tree bark, carefully selected from specific types of trees and properly prepared by soaking and grinding, could be mixed with grain to extend their food supplies without creating meals that were unpalatable. Even the leather from worn-out shoes and tools, when cut into small pieces and boiled for hours, could provide a chewy but nutritious addition to their daily stew. The management of their clothing and bedding required constant attention during this period. Everything they owned had to serve multiple purposes, and the distinction between day clothes and night clothes became meaningless when survival depended on wearing every available layer. Agnes learned to arrange their garments in specific configurations that maximized warmth while allowing for the movement necessary for daily tasks. Their woolen clothes, when damp from the humidity in their poorly sealed cottage, had to be dried carefully to prevent the fibers from becoming matted and losing their insulating properties. Agnes developed a system of rotating their garments around their fire, ensuring that nothing stayed wet long enough to become useless, while also preventing any item from becoming so dry that it would be damaged by the heat. The psychological challenges of surviving in these conditions were as significant as the physical ones. The constant cold, the never-ending need to tend their fire, the limited diet, and the cramped living conditions created stresses that tested the bonds between husband and wife. Agnes and William learned to divide their daily tasks in ways that minimized conflict while ensuring that essential work was completed. William took responsibility for maintaining their fire and collecting fuel, tasks that required him to venture outside regularly and provided necessary physical activity. Agnes managed their food preparation and the increasingly complex arrangements inside their shelter, work that required patience and attention to detail, but could be done in the relative warmth near their hearth. They also developed rituals that helped maintain their emotional well-being during the darkest and coldest weeks. Each evening, before retiring to their improvised sleeping area, they would spend time talking about their plans for the spring, discussing the crops they would plant, and the repairs they would make to their cottage when the weather improved. These conversations served not only as a form of entertainment during long winter nights, but as a way of maintaining hope and connection to a future beyond their current hardships. The community life of Wickham during this period took on characteristics that would have been unimaginable during more prosperous times. Neighbors who had maintained polite but distant relationships for years found themselves sharing resources and knowledge out of necessity. The techniques that Agnes and William developed for managing their damaged shelter were quickly shared, with other families facing similar challenges. Maud, the elderly neighbor who had discovered the technique of heating stones for bed warmers, expanded her innovations to include methods for preserving food in underground caches that remained unfrozen, even during the harshest weather. Robert, the young man skilled with leather, began teaching others how to waterproof not just clothing, but also containers and even sections of walls that could be treated to provide better weather resistance. The village priest, recognizing that the spiritual needs of his parishioners were inseparable from their physical survival, began incorporating practical advice into his sermons. He shared knowledge about which plants could be safely consumed during times of food scarcity, how to prevent frostbite and other cold-related injuries, and techniques for maintaining morale during extended periods of hardship. As January progressed toward February, Agnes and William's cottage had evolved into something quite different from a conventional medieval peasant dwelling. The interior space was now organized into distinct microclimates, each serving specific functions. The area immediately around the fire was kept as warm and dry as possible, serving as their primary living space during the day and the location for all cooking activities. Their sleeping enclosure, while cramped, maintained a temperature that allowed for restful sleep even on the coldest nights. The colder areas of their cottage were not simply abandoned, but were used for storage and activities that did not require warmth. Here they kept their supplies of fuel, their tools, and their stores of food that benefited from cold storage. William even discovered that the coldest corner of their cottage, where drafts were strongest, could be used as a kind of natural refrigerator for preserving meat and dairy products. By early February, when the worst of the cold finally began, to moderate slightly, Agnes and William had not merely survived their ordeal, they had developed a comprehensive set of techniques for living in extremely challenging conditions. Their experience during the winter of 1363-1364 would become part of the folk knowledge passed down to their children and grandchildren, contributing to the accumulated wisdom that allowed rural English families to survive the climatic challenges of the Little Ice Age. The lessons they learned extended far beyond the immediate challenges of staying warm and dry. They had discovered the importance of flexibility in the face of changing circumstances, the value of community cooperation during times of crisis, and the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to develop innovative solutions when survival depends on it. Their cottage, though still damaged and far from comfortable by modern standards, had become a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. As the days grew imperceptibly longer and the promise of spring grew stronger, Agnes and William began to contemplate the repairs they would undertake when warmer weather finally arrived. But they also knew that their experience during this brutal winter had taught them lessons that would prove valuable for the rest of their lives and for the lives of their descendants who would face their own challenges in the unpredictable climate of medieval England. In the village of Little Wickham, nestled in the rolling countryside of Hertfordshire, the harvest season of 1547 carried an urgency that extended far beyond the typical rhythm of agricultural life. The peasant family of Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, along with their 3 children, young Samuel, aged 14, Mary, 12, and little Catherine, only 7, faced the approaching winter with the knowledge that their preparations during these crucial autumn weeks would determine whether they survived until spring or joined the growing number of rural poor who perished during the harsh months of the Little Ice Age. The Hartwell cottage, built in the traditional style that had served English peasant families for centuries, showed the accumulated wear of nearly 30 years of habitation. Its wattle and daub walls, once smooth and uniform in their pale whitewash coating, now displayed a patchwork of repairs where different clays and binding materials had been used to fill cracks and holes. The thatch roof, originally a golden crown of carefully laid wheat straw, had become a mottled landscape of older, darkened sections interspersed with brighter patches where emergency repairs had been made with whatever materials Thomas could obtain. But it was not merely the physical condition of their dwelling that concerned the Hartwells as the days grew shorter and the first frosts appeared on the meadow grasses. The winter of 1546-1547 had been particularly brutal, one of a series of severe seasons that marked the depth of the Little Ice Age in England. Rivers that had not frozen in living memory had become solid enough to walk across, and many families throughout the region had lost livestock, crops, and in some cases their lives to the unprecedented cold. Thomas knew, with the accumulated wisdom passed down from his father and grandfather, that survival depended not on any single technique or strategy, but on the careful coordination of dozens of small preparations, each essential to the larger project of making it through the dark months ahead. As he looked at his family's modest stores of grain, their small collection of preserved meats, and the gaps in their roof that would need attention before the rains came, he understood that the next few weeks would be critical. The process of preparing for winter began with an assessment that was both practical and psychological. Margaret walked through their cottage systematically, examining every corner and surface with the eye of someone whose survival depended on identifying potential problems before they became critical. She noted the places where mice might be able to penetrate their food stores, the areas where cold drafts were most problematic, and the spots where moisture had accumulated during the previous winter's storms. In the small storage area attached to the main cottage, Margaret and Thomas counted and examined their preserved foods with meticulous care. The salted pork that had been prepared during the autumn slaughter was examined piece by piece, checking for any signs of spoilage or inadequate preservation. Each piece of meat was unwrapped from its linen covering, inspected for discoloration or unpleasant odors, and then carefully rewrapped and repositioned in the storage containers. Their stores of cheese, made during the summer months when their cow's milk production was highest, required similar attention. The hard cheeses, coated with a layer of beeswax to prevent moisture loss, were turned and examined for cracks in their protective coating. The softer cheeses, preserved in brine, needed to have their liquid checked and refreshed to ensure proper preservation throughout the winter months. But perhaps the most critical assessment involved their supply of grain. The wheat, barley, and oats that would provide the foundation of their winter diet had to be examined for signs of insect infestation, mold, or rodent damage. Thomas ran his hands through each container, feeling for the telltale warmth that indicated fermentation or decay, listening for the subtle sounds that might reveal the presence of weevils or other pests. The grain stores represented more than simple sustenance. They were the foundation upon which all other survival strategies depended. Without adequate grain, the family would be forced to supplement their diet with foods that were less nutritious and more difficult to obtain during winter months. The careful management of their grain supplies, determining how much could be consumed each week, calculating how to make the stores last until the next harvest, required mathematical precision that most modern people would find challenging. Margaret had developed, over years of managing her household during difficult winters, a complex understanding of the relationship between different types of preserved foods and their family's nutritional needs. She knew that the dried beans and peas, while filling, needed to be supplemented with other foods to provide complete nutrition. She understood that the preserved vegetables, turnips and parsnips stored in layers of sand, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, pickled cabbage in wooden casks, each served specific purposes in maintaining health during the long months when fresh foods were unavailable. The preparation of additional preserved foods continued throughout the autumn weeks, with each member of the family contributing according to their abilities and knowledge. Young Samuel, who had reached an age where he could be trusted with important tasks, helped his father with the smoking of fish caught in the local streams and ponds. The process required careful attention to the temperature and duration of smoking, as well as the selection of proper wood for the smoke. Oak and beech were preferred for their clean-burning properties and the pleasant flavor they imparted to the preserved fish. Mary, despite her youth, had learned from her mother the intricate process of preparing pickled vegetables. The timing of this work was crucial, as vegetables needed to be pickled at the peak of their freshness, but after the harvest was complete and before the first hard frosts that would damage the remaining crops. Mary helped prepare the brine solutions, carefully measuring salt and vinegar in proportions that had been perfected through generations of trial and error. Even little Catherine contributed to the family's preservation efforts, gathering nuts and berries under her mother's careful supervision. The child learned to identify which nuts were properly ripened and which berries could be safely dried for winter consumption. This knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter for countless generations, represented a form of education that was often more vital to survival than any formal learning. The work of food preservation was complicated by the limitations of their storage facilities and the unpredictable nature of the weather. The Hartwells' cottage included a small root cellar dug into the ground beneath one corner of the main room, which provided cool, stable temperatures for storing certain types of food. But this space was limited, and not all of their preserved foods could be stored there. Much of their food had to be kept in the main room of the cottage, where it was exposed to fluctuations in temperature and humidity that could affect its preservation. Thomas spent considerable time during these autumn weeks working on improvements to their storage systems. He reinforced the wooden containers that held their grain, adding tight-fitting lids and checking for gaps where insects or moisture might penetrate. He improved the ventilation in their storage areas, creating small openings that would allow air circulation while preventing the entry of rain or snow. The question of fuel for heating and cooking required as much attention as food preservation. The Hartwells, like most peasant families, depended primarily on wood for fuel, supplemented by other combustible materials when wood was scarce. But wood had to be gathered, cut, and properly seasoned to burn efficiently, and this work had to be completed before the weather made it impossible to work outdoors. Thomas and Samuel spent long days in the woodlands surrounding their village, identifying dead trees and fallen branches that could be harvested for fuel. The work was physically demanding and required knowledge of which types of wood burned best, how to cut and split logs efficiently, and how to transport heavy loads of fuel back to their cottage. The wood had to be stacked and stored in ways that would keep it dry throughout the winter, a challenge given the limitations of their storage space and the poor condition of their cottage roof. But wood was only part of their fuel requirements. Margaret and the children gathered alternative combustible materials that could supplement their wood supply when needed. Dried animal dung, carefully collected and stored, could be mixed with wood to create a slower-burning fuel that provided steady heat for cooking. Dried grasses and crop stubble, bundled and tied, could be used for quick, hot fires when rapid heating was needed. The family also prepared backup plans for situations where their primary fuel supplies might be depleted or inaccessible. They identified sources of emergency fuel, furniture that could be broken up and burned if necessary, wooden tools that could be sacrificed in extreme circumstances, even structural elements of their cottage that could be removed if survival depended on it. As the autumn weeks progressed and the first serious storms of the season began to test the village's defenses, the Hartwells faced the reality that their preparations, however thorough, might not be sufficient for the challenges ahead. The condition of their cottage roof, while improved by Thomas's repairs, still allowed water to penetrate during heavy rains. Their stores of food, while carefully prepared and calculated, represented a quantity that would require careful rationing to last through the winter. Yet the family also possessed something that could not be measured or stored: the accumulated knowledge and experience of previous generations who had faced similar challenges. Margaret carried in her memory the recipes and techniques her mother had taught her, methods for making food last longer and taste better even when ingredients were limited. Thomas understood the rhythms of weather and season that would tell him when to expect the worst storms and when brief improvements might allow for essential outdoor work. The children, too, were learning lessons that would serve them throughout their lives. Samuel was developing the physical skills and knowledge needed to provide for a family during difficult times. Mary was learning the complex domestic arts that would allow her to manage a household efficiently and economically. Even young Catherine was absorbing the attitudes and patience that would allow them to endure hardship without losing hope or determination. The social dimension of winter preparation was as important as the practical aspects. The Hartwells lived in a community where individual survival often depended on collective cooperation, and the autumn months were a time when neighbors assessed not only their own readiness for winter, but also the preparedness of those around them. A family that was inadequately prepared could become a burden on the entire community, while those who had surplus resources might find themselves called upon to share with less fortunate neighbors. Thomas made careful observations of the other families in Little Wicken, noting which households seemed well prepared for the coming winter and which might need assistance. The widow Alice, who lived alone in a cottage even more dilapidated than the Hartwells, clearly lacked the resources to make adequate preparations. The young couple, John and Susan, recently married and inexperienced in managing a household through difficult winters, had made enthusiastic but possibly inadequate attempts at food preservation. These assessments were not mere curiosity, but practical calculations that could affect the Hartwells' own survival strategies. If too many families in the village were inadequately prepared, the resulting demands for charity and assistance could strain the resources of everyone. If neighboring families had surplus resources, opportunities for trade and mutual assistance might develop that could benefit all parties involved. The psychological preparation for winter was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the autumn work. Margaret and Thomas had to prepare themselves and their children for months of limited food, cold temperatures, cramped living conditions, and the constant stress of managing resources that were barely adequate for survival. They had to maintain hope and determination while also being realistic about the challenges they would face. The family developed rituals and practices that would help them maintain morale during the difficult months ahead. Margaret began teaching the children songs and stories that could provide entertainment during long winter evenings when there was little else to do. Thomas planned projects that could be worked on indoors during the coldest weather. Tool maintenance, simple carpentry tasks and repairs to clothing and household items. As November approached and the first hard frosts killed the remaining garden plants, the Hartwells made their final preparations for winter. They brought the last of their preserved foods into storage, secured their cottage as well as possible against the weather, and settled into the rhythm of life that would sustain them through the months ahead. But even as they completed these preparations, Thomas and Margaret knew that their survival would depend not just on what they had accomplished during the autumn weeks, but on their ability to adapt and improvise throughout the winter months ahead. The techniques of food preservation that seemed so important now were only the beginning of a longer story of survival that would test every aspect of their knowledge, skills, and determination. how would their carefully laid plans hold up against the reality of a little ice age winter, and what innovations would they be forced to develop when their preparations proved insufficient? The blizzard that struck Little Wicken in the second week of December 1547 arrived with a ferocity that challenged every preparation the Hartwell family had made during the autumn months. Records that during the Little Ice Age, winters could bring frost and snow lasting from mid-October through late April, and this particular winter seemed determined to exceed even those harsh standards. Margaret woke on the morning of December 12th to discover that the wooden bowl positioned beneath their roof's primary leak had not only filled with water during the night, but had frozen solid, creating a dome of ice that had pushed the container askew. More alarming still, she could see her breath in the cottage's interior, indicating that the temperature inside their dwelling had dropped to levels that made normal daily activities nearly impossible. The first challenge of this harsh morning was simply rekindling their fire from the banked coals of the previous evening. Thomas had learned from his father the technique of covering glowing embers with ash and carefully arranged fuel so that they would maintain enough heat to ignite fresh wood in the morning. But the extreme cold had drawn so much heat from their cottage that even this reliable method nearly failed. Thomas spent nearly an hour coaxing flames from the reluctant coals, carefully feeding tiny pieces of dried bark and tinder until he achieved a fire strong enough to accept larger pieces of wood. The process of preparing their morning meal demonstrated how thoroughly the extreme weather had disrupted their normal routines. Margaret discovered that the pot of pottage she had prepared the previous evening had frozen into a solid mass that required careful thawing before it could be heated and consumed. The water they kept for cooking and cleaning had formed a layer of ice that had to be broken and melted before it could be used. Even their supply of ale, normally resistant to freezing due to its alcohol content, had developed a slushy consistency that made it unpleasant to drink. Young Samuel, sent to check on their small store of root vegetables in the partially underground storage area, returned with news that was both encouraging and concerning. The vegetables themselves had not frozen completely, protected by the earth's insulation, but the containers that held them were now surrounded by ice that made access difficult. Retrieving their stored food would require careful work to avoid damaging the containers or the vegetables themselves. The family's response to these conditions revealed the remarkable adaptability that allowed Tudor peasants to survive in circumstances that would challenge modern survival experts. Margaret immediately reorganized their daily routine to accommodate the new realities. Instead of preparing individual meals throughout the day, she began cooking larger quantities of food during the warmest part of the day when their fire was most effective, and then reheating smaller portions as needed. This shift required careful planning of their fuel consumption. Wood that might have been used for multiple cooking fires throughout the day now had to be allocated to maintaining a single, larger fire that could handle all cooking tasks while also providing maximum heating for their living space. Margaret learned to coordinate her cooking activities so that items requiring different temperatures and cooking times could all be prepared using the same fire at different stages of its burning cycle. The children adapted to the cold by developing new patterns of activity that helped them stay warm while contributing to the family's survival efforts. Mary and Catherine spent hours each day working on textile tasks, spinning wool, mending clothing, and preparing materials for future use, activities that required fine motor control and helped maintain circulation in their fingers. Samuel worked with his father on indoor projects that required physical activity, resharpening tools, preparing kindling for the fire, and organizing their stored supplies. The family also discovered that their sleeping arrangements needed to be completely reorganized for the extreme cold. the simple expedient of sharing body heat became essential for survival, with all 5 family members sleeping together in a space that was barely large enough for 2 adults. They learned to arrange their bodies to maximize warmth sharing while minimizing the discomfort of such close quarters, and they developed techniques for managing their limited bedding to provide the best possible insulation. But perhaps the most significant adaptation involved their relationship with food and the techniques Margaret had learned for preservation during the autumn months. As the winter progressed and their stored supplies began to dwindle, she was forced to develop new methods for making their provisions last longer while maintaining adequate nutrition for her family. Margaret discovered that the salted pork they had prepared during the autumn could be made to stretch much further by using it primarily as a flavoring agent rather than as a main source of protein. Instead of serving substantial portions of meat with each meal, she learned to use small amounts of the preserved pork to add flavor to larger quantities of grain-based dishes. A piece of salted meat the size of her thumb, when simmered slowly with a pot of barley and vegetables, could provide satisfying flavor for a meal that would feed the entire family. The preserved vegetables that had seemed so abundant during the autumn harvest now had to be managed with mathematical precision. Margaret calculated exactly how many turnips, parsnips, and onions they could consume each week, while ensuring that their supplies would last until spring. She learned to use vegetable peelings and scraps that would normally have been discarded, incorporating them into stocks and broths that extracted every possible bit of nutrition from their limited supplies. The techniques for preserving dairy, products that Margaret had learned from her mother, proved especially valuable during the harshest weeks of winter. The hard cheeses, properly preserved with their protective coating of beeswax, provided concentrated nutrition that could supplement their grain-based diet, but Margaret learned to use these precious resources sparingly, grating small amounts of cheese to add flavor and protein to dishes that were primarily composed of less expensive ingredients. The family's relationship with their few domestic animals also changed dramatically during the extreme cold. Their cow, the source of milk that had been essential for their summer cheese making, now required careful management to keep her alive through the winter. Thomas and Samuel spent considerable effort each day ensuring that the animal had access to unfrozen water and adequate fodder, knowing that her survival was essential for their family's future prosperity. The chickens, normally allowed to roam freely around their cottage and find much of their own food, now required daily attention to prevent them from freezing. The family learned to bring the birds into their cottage during the coldest nights, creating a complex living arrangement where humans and animals shared the limited warm space around their fire. While this created additional challenges in terms of cleanliness and crowding, it also provided the benefit of additional body heat that helped warm their living space. As January progressed and the cold showed no signs of moderating, the Hartwells faced a crisis that tested the limits of their preparation and adaptability. Their carefully calculated supplies of firewood, which should have been adequate for a normal winter, were being consumed more rapidly than anticipated because of the extreme temperatures. Thomas realized that unless they could find additional sources of fuel, they would be forced to choose between staying warm and cooking their food. The solution to this crisis required innovations that went beyond traditional peasant survival techniques. Thomas began systematically dismantling parts of their cottage that were not essential for immediate shelter, using fence posts, roof supports from unused areas, and even some of the wooden framework from their storage areas as emergency fuel. This was not simply a matter of burning furniture, but a calculated process of selectively removing structural elements that could be spared without compromising the integrity of their shelter. Margaret developed techniques for cooking that required less fuel while still providing nutritious meals for her family. She learned to use retained heat from stones that had been heated in their fire, wrapping these stones in cloth and using them to continue cooking food even after the fire had been reduced to conserve fuel. She discovered that certain combinations of ingredients required less cooking time while still producing filling and nutritious meals. The psychological challenges of surviving these conditions were as significant as the physical ones. The constant cold, the limited diet, the cramped living conditions, and the uncertainty about whether their resources would last until spring created stresses that tested the bonds between family members. Margaret and Thomas had to develop strategies for maintaining morale and preventing the kind of conflicts that could be devastating in such close quarters. They established routines that provided structure and purpose during the long winter days. Each family member had specific responsibilities that contributed to their collective survival, and these tasks were organized so that everyone felt they were making meaningful contributions. Samuel took pride in his ability to maintain their fire and manage their fuel supplies. Mary became expert at preparing the simpler meals that conserved their precious ingredients while still providing adequate nutrition. The family also developed entertainment and educational activities that helped pass the long winter evenings while building skills that would be valuable throughout their lives. Thomas taught Samuel more advanced techniques for working with wood and metal, knowledge that would be essential when the young man eventually established his own household. Margaret continued Mary's education in domestic arts, sharing not just practical techniques, but also the accumulated wisdom about managing households during difficult times. Even young Catherine was learning lessons that would serve her throughout her life. She absorbed the attitudes and techniques that allowed her family to survive extreme hardship without losing hope or determination. She learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and to understand her role in the complex web of family survival. By the end of January, the Hartwell cottage had become something quite different from a conventional Tudor peasant dwelling. The interior space was organized around the single source of heat, with every arrangement designed to maximize warmth retention and efficient use of their limited resources. Their daily routines had evolved into a precise choreography that allowed 5 people to live, work, and sleep in a space that was barely adequate for normal times. Yet despite the hardships they endured, the family had not merely survived, they had adapted and innovated in ways that would serve them well in future. Difficult winters. The techniques Margaret had developed for stretching their food supplies, Thomas's methods for maximizing fuel efficiency, and the children's contributions to the family's survival efforts had all become part of their accumulated knowledge for managing extreme circumstances. As February approached and the first subtle signs of lengthening days began to appear, the Hartwells faced the question of whether their innovations and adaptations would be sufficient to carry them through what promised to be several more months of challenging weather. Would their carefully managed resources last until spring, and what new challenges would test their ingenuity in the weeks ahead? The morning of March 15th, 1548, brought to the Hartwell cottage something that had been absent for nearly 4 months, the sound of water dripping from their roof that was not caused by ice melting and refreezing, but by genuine thaw. Margaret stood in her doorway, listening to the steady patter of drops falling from the eaves, and realized that she was hearing the first true sign that their ordeal was beginning to draw toward a close. But this promise of spring brought its own challenges, ones that would test the survival skills the family had developed during the harsh winter months in entirely new ways. The melting snow and ice that had accumulated around their cottage throughout the winter was now turning their immediate surroundings into a bog of mud and standing water. The roof leaks that had been manageable when they brought only small amounts of ice and snow now threatened to flood their living space as the volume of meltwater increased dramatically. Thomas spent the first warm day in months on his cottage roof, working frantically to improve their weather protection before the full force of the spring thaw created conditions inside their home that might be worse than anything they had endured during the winter. The thatch that had provided minimal protection during the cold months was now thoroughly saturated, and in some areas the underlying wooden structure had been weakened by months of exposure to moisture and freeze-thaw cycles. The work was both urgent and dangerous. Thomas had to balance on wet, slippery thatch while handling tools and materials that could easily cause serious injury if he fell. But the knowledge he had gained during the winter months about which areas of their roof were most vulnerable allowed him to focus his efforts on the repairs that would provide the greatest improvement in their shelter's weather resistance. Margaret, meanwhile, faced the complex challenge of reorganizing their interior living arrangements for the changing conditions. The tight, heat-conserving arrangements that had served them well during the extreme cold were now inappropriate for the warmer, wetter conditions of early spring. She had to expand their living space while also creating better drainage and ventilation to deal with the increased moisture from both the melting snow outside and the higher humidity inside their cottage. The family's food situation as spring approached illustrated both the success and the limitations of their winter survival strategies. Margaret's careful rationing and innovative cooking techniques had indeed made their preserved supplies last through the worst of the winter, but their stores were now critically low, and the spring foods they had hoped to supplement their diet, early greens, fresh eggs from their chickens, milk from their cow, were still weeks away from being available in meaningful quantities. This period required perhaps the greatest ingenuity Margaret had shown throughout the entire winter. She had to find ways to feed her family adequately during the gap between the exhaustion of their winter stores and the availability of spring foods. Her solution involved a combination of techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered normal peasant survival practice. Margaret learned to identify and prepare wild plants that were among the first to emerge as the snow melted. The tender shoots of nettles, carefully gathered and prepared, provided fresh greens that helped combat the nutritional deficiencies that had accumulated during months of limited diet. The inner bark of certain trees, when properly prepared, could supplement their dwindling grain supplies. Even weeds and grasses that were normally considered worthless could be incorporated into their meals to provide bulk and some nutritional value. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the family's spring transition was how their experiences during the winter had changed their understanding of what constituted adequate preparation for future challenging periods. Samuel, who had entered the winter as a boy learning basic survival skills from his father, emerged as a young man with comprehensive knowledge of resource management, emergency improvisation, and the psychological techniques needed to maintain morale during extended hardship. Mary had developed domestic skills that went far beyond what would normally be expected of a 12-year-old girl. Her understanding of food preservation, rationing, and preparation had been refined through months of working alongside her mother under extreme conditions. She had learned not just the techniques for managing a household, but also the flexibility and creativity needed to adapt those techniques when normal methods proved inadequate. Even young Catherine had gained knowledge and attitudes that would serve her throughout her life. She had learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments, to understand her role in a family's collective survival, and to maintain hope and determination even under the most challenging circumstances. Thomas's experience during the winter had expanded his understanding of housing and shelter in ways that would influence his approach to home maintenance and improvement for the rest of his life. He had learned which structural elements of a cottage were essential and which could be sacrificed in emergencies. He had developed techniques for maximizing fuel efficiency, managing moisture and ventilation, and maintaining livable conditions, even when the basic systems of shelter were compromised. The social dimension of their winter survival had also created lasting changes in the fabric of village life in Little Wicken. The techniques and innovations that individual families had developed during the harsh months were shared throughout the community, creating a pool of collective knowledge that would benefit everyone during future difficult periods. The widow Alice, who had struggled to survive the winter alone, was now included in cooperative arrangements that would help her prepare more effectively for future challenges. The young couple, John and Susan, whose inexperience had made their first winter of marriage particularly difficult, had learned from neighbors like the Hartwells and were now beginning to develop the skills and knowledge they would need to manage their own household through future emergencies. The community as a whole had become more resilient, not just because individual families had learned to survive extreme conditions, but because the social networks and cooperative relationships had been strengthened through shared adversity. As April progressed and the signs of genuine spring became unmistakable, the return of migrating birds, the emergence of early wildflowers, the first tender leaves on the trees, the Hartwell family began the process of rebuilding and recovery that would prepare them for the next cycle of seasons. Thomas undertook the major roof repairs that had been impossible during the winter months, this time with a deeper understanding of how weather could stress and damage the structure of a cottage. Margaret began the work of restocking their food supplies, but now with knowledge gained through months of testing the limits of preservation and rationing techniques. She understood which methods had worked well and which had proven inadequate. She knew which foods were truly essential for winter survival and which were merely desirable. Her approach to autumn preservation would be informed by the practical experience of having lived through a winter when every calorie and every technique had been tested under extreme conditions. The children resumed the normal activities of spring and summer, helping with planting, tending animals, gathering wild foods, but now with a maturity and understanding that came from having made essential contributions to their family's survival during the crisis months. Samuel took on greater responsibilities in managing the family's resources and planning for future needs. Mary began teaching some of the domestic techniques she had learned to younger children in the village, passing on knowledge that might prove vital during future difficult winters. The Hartwell family's experience during the winter of 1547-1548 had demonstrated the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to adapt and innovate when survival depends on it. They had not merely endured extreme hardship, but had developed new techniques and approaches that expanded the possibilities for survival in challenging circumstances. Their story became part of the accumulated wisdom of their community, contributing to the knowledge that would help future generations face their own survival challenges. The techniques Margaret had developed for food preservation and rationing, Thomas's innovations in shelter management and fuel conservation, and the family's collective approach to maintaining morale and cooperation during extended hardship had all become part of the practical education that would be passed down to their children and grandchildren. The winter that had tested them so severely had also taught them lessons that would prove valuable not just for surviving future harsh seasons, but for thriving during more prosperous times as well. As the Hartwells looked ahead to the summer months of 1548, they did so with a confidence born of tested knowledge and proven adaptability. They had learned that survival was not simply a matter of adequate preparation, but of the ability to improvise, adapt, and innovate when circumstances exceeded their planning. They had discovered resources within themselves and their community that they had not known existed, and they had developed techniques and relationships that would serve them well regardless of what future challenges they might face. The cottage that had sheltered them through their ordeal still showed the signs of that difficult winter, but it also bore testimony to human ingenuity and determination. The repairs and modifications they had made, the systems they had developed for managing resources and maintaining livable conditions, and the knowledge they had gained through months of testing and adaptation had all become part of their permanent legacy, ensuring that future winters would never again find them unprepared for whatever challenges the Little Ice Age climate might bring. In the village of Ashworth, where the River Kennet meandered through the chalk downs of what would later become Berkshire, the morning of St. Crispin's Day in 1284 found master craftsman Aldrich, the builder, examining a wall that told the story of 3 generations of peasant life. The cottage belonged to Godwin the ploughman and his family, and its walls displayed the accumulated repairs, modifications and patches that marked nearly 40 years of continuous habitation through seasons of plenty and years of hardship. You might think that the construction of a peasant dwelling was a simple matter of throwing together whatever materials came to hand, but you would be mistaken. The technique of wattle and daub construction, which provided shelter for the majority of England's rural population, represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about working with natural materials, understanding structural forces, and creating buildings that could withstand the vagaries of English weather while remaining affordable for families of modest means. Aldrich ran his weathered hands along the wall's surface, feeling for the subtle signs that revealed the history hidden within. The clay and timber construction. Here, where the wall met the ground, he could detect the slight softness that indicated moisture penetration from below. There, at shoulder height, a different texture showed where an emergency repair had been made with clay from a different source, mixed with straw rather than the animal hair that had been used in the original construction. The wattle and daub technique that had built this cottage began with the selection and preparation of materials that were, by necessity, gathered from the immediate vicinity of the building site. The wooden framework, the wattle, required specific types of wood chosen for their flexibility, durability, and availability. Hazel was preferred for its combination of strength and bendability, allowing craftsmen to weave branches into tight, secure patterns that would hold their shape under the weight of the clay daub. Willow, when hazel was unavailable, provided similar qualities, though it required different techniques for cutting and preparation. The harvesting of wattle material followed seasonal rhythms that modern people have largely forgotten. The best, hazel and willow, came from trees that had been coppiced, cut back to ground level every 7 to 10 years to encourage the growth of long, straight shoots. This practice not only provided superior building materials, but also maintained woodland ecosystems that supported diverse plant and animal communities. Aldrich could determine the quality of wattle material simply by examining the color and texture of the wood, looking for the signs that indicated proper harvesting time and adequate seasoning. The preparation of the wooden framework required tools and techniques that had been refined over generations of practice. The hazel or willow shoots had to be split lengthwise using specialized tools, a froe and mallet for splitting, draw knives for shaping, and various gauges for ensuring consistent thickness. The craftsman had to understand how wood behaved as it dried and aged, planning joints and connections that would remain tight even as the material seasoned and settled. But the wattle framework was only the beginning of the construction process. The daub, the clay mixture that filled the spaces between the wooden elements, required knowledge of soil types, mixing techniques, and application methods that transformed simple earth into a weather-resistant building material. The clay for daub could not be just any soil. It needed specific proportions of clay particles, sand, and organic matter to achieve the proper consistency and durability. Aldrich examined the exposed sections of the cottage wall where weather and time had revealed the internal structure of the daub. The original builders had used clay from the local riverbank, mixed with sand from the same source to provide stability and prevent excessive shrinkage as the material dried. But the most critical ingredient was the organic binding material, usually chopped straw, animal hair, or a combination of both, that gave the daub its tensile strength and prevented it from cracking as it cured. The mixing of daub was a process. that required both physical strength and technical knowledge. The clay, sand, and organic materials had to be combined with exactly the right amount of water to achieve a consistency that would adhere to the wattle framework while remaining workable long enough for proper application. Too wet, and the mixture would slump and fail to hold its shape. Too dry, and it would not adhere properly to the wooden framework or spread evenly across the surface. Traditional daub mixing was done by treading. Workers would remove their shoes and stockings and trample the materials together in a shallow pit, adding water gradually until the proper consistency was achieved. This method ensured thorough mixing while allowing the workers to feel the texture of the material and make adjustments as needed. Children often participated in this process, their lighter weight making them ideal for the initial mixing stages, while adults completed the work that required more strength and experience. The application of daub to the wattle framework required techniques that balanced speed with precision. The material had to be worked into all the spaces between the wooden elements, ensuring complete coverage while avoiding the air pockets that could create weak spots vulnerable to weather damage. Craftsmen used their hands and simple tools, wooden paddles, trowels made from flat stones or pieces of pottery to spread and smooth the daub, creating surfaces that would shed water effectively while maintaining structural integrity. But Aldrich's examination of Godwin's cottage walls revealed that the original construction, however skillfully executed, was only the beginning of a building story. Over the decades since the cottage had been built, weather, settling, and normal wear had created numerous problems that required ongoing maintenance and repair. The techniques for maintaining wattle and daub construction were as important as the original building methods and often more challenging because repairs had to be integrated with existing structures that might have been altered by years of exposure to the elements. The most common problem Aldrich observed was the gradual deterioration of the daub surface due to repeated cycles of wetting and drying. English weather, with its combination of driving rain, frost, and occasional hot, dry summers, subjected wattle and daub walls to stresses that gradually broke down even the best original construction. The surface of the daub would develop small cracks that allowed water to penetrate deeper into the wall, leading to larger cracks and eventually to sections where the daub separated from the wattle framework entirely. Repairing these damaged sections required not only technical skill but also careful analysis of why the original construction had failed. Sometimes the problem was simply age. The organic binding materials in the daub had decomposed over time, leaving the clay matrix without adequate tensile strength. In other cases, poor drainage around the building had allowed water to accumulate at the base of the walls, creating conditions that promoted deterioration from below. Aldrich had developed, through decades of experience, techniques for matching new repair materials to existing construction. This was not simply a matter of using the same clay source, because soil conditions could change over time due to flooding, seasonal variations, or changes in land use. The craftsman had to understand how different clay sources would behave when mixed with the existing wall materials and how to modify mixing techniques to compensate for variations in raw materials. The tools required for wattle and daub repair were generally simple, but their effective use required considerable skill and experience. Aldrich carried with him a selection of knives for cutting and shaping wattle materials, various trowels and paddles for working with daub, and specialized tools for cleaning and preparing damaged surfaces. But more important than the tools was his understanding of how materials behaved under different conditions and how to adapt techniques to the specific requirements of each repair job. The seasonal timing of repair work was critical to its success. Daub repairs had to be done during weather conditions that allowed proper curing of the clay materials, not too hot and dry, which would cause rapid shrinkage and cracking, but also not too wet and cold, which would prevent proper adhesion and setting. Experienced craftsmen learned to read weather patterns and plan their work accordingly, often maintaining schedules that coordinated multiple repair projects with the optimal conditions for each type of work. As Aldrich continued his examination of Godwin's cottage, he noted the various techniques that previous repairmen had used to address different types of damage. Here, where the daub had separated from the wattle framework in a large section, someone had attempted to patch the hole with a mixture that included too much straw and not enough clay, creating a repair that was already beginning to fail after only a few seasons. There, where cracks had developed around a window opening, the repair work showed evidence of proper technique. The damaged material had been carefully removed, the wattle framework had been cleaned and prepared, and new daub had been applied in thin layers that bonded well with the existing construction. The social and economic aspects of wattle and daub construction were as important as the technical considerations. Most peasant families could not afford to hire skilled craftsmen for routine maintenance, so they had to develop their own capabilities for basic repair work. This created a body of folk knowledge that was passed down within families and communities, with each generation learning the techniques needed to maintain their homes while also developing innovations and improvements based on local conditions and available materials. The cottage that Aldrich was examining bore witness to this tradition of family-based maintenance. The various repairs visible in its walls showed different levels of skill and different approaches to solving construction problems, reflecting the knowledge and capabilities of the family members who had lived there over the decades. Some repairs showed the confidence and skill of someone who understood the principles of wattle and daub construction. Others revealed the tentative efforts of someone learning the techniques through trial and error. But even the less skilled repairs served important functions in the ongoing life of the building. A patch that might not meet the standards of a professional craftsman could still provide years of adequate protection from the weather, buying time for the family to develop better techniques or acquire the resources needed for more permanent solutions. The accumulated evidence of these repair efforts told the story of a building that had been continuously loved and cared for by the families who depended on it for shelter. As the morning sun climbed higher and began to warm the cottage walls, Aldrich completed his preliminary examination and began to plan the repair work that would be needed to restore the building's weather resistance. The challenges he faced were typical of those encountered by craftsmen throughout medieval England. How to match new materials to old construction, how to integrate repairs with existing structures that had been modified over time, and how to balance the ideal techniques with the practical constraints of time, materials, and budget. But the deeper challenge was one that connected Aldrich's work to the broader story of how ordinary people created and maintained the built environment that sheltered medieval England's rural population. The techniques he would use, the materials he would select, and the methods he would employ were all part of a tradition of knowledge that had been developed and refined through countless individual projects, each one contributing to the accumulated wisdom about building with earth and wood in the challenging English climate. What specific techniques would prove most effective for the repairs needed on Godwin's cottage, and how would this individual project contribute to the larger story of medieval construction knowledge? The repair work on Godwin's cottage began before dawn on the morning following Aldrich's initial examination, as the craftsman needed to take advantage of every hour of favorable weather before the autumn rains made outdoor construction work impossible. Medieval chronicles describes how the daub mixture required specific weather conditions for proper curing, and Aldrich had learned through decades of experience to read the subtle signs in cloud formations and wind patterns that predicted the best working conditions. Godwin and his eldest son Edmund joined Aldrich in the pre-dawn darkness, helping to organize tools and materials that would be needed for the day's work. This was not simply a matter of providing labor for the craftsman, but an opportunity for the family to learn techniques that would allow them to maintain their home more effectively in the future. The knowledge that Aldrich would share during the repair process was as valuable as the physical improvements he would make to their cottage. The first task was the careful removal of damaged daub from the areas that required repair. This work required more skill and patience than might be apparent to casual observers. Simply chipping away the deteriorated material could damage the underlying wattle framework or create irregular surfaces that would make it difficult to apply new daub effectively. Aldrich used a combination of hand tools and careful technique to remove only the material that was beyond repair while preserving everything that could be saved. The tools for this delicate work included knives of various sizes for cutting and scraping, wooden paddles for prying loose sections without damaging adjacent areas, and brushes made from bundles of twigs for cleaning debris from the wattle framework. But more important than the tools was Aldrich's ability to assess the condition of each section of wall and determine exactly how much material needed to be removed to create a sound foundation for the repair. As he worked, Aldrich explained to Godwin and Edmund the signs that indicated different types of damage and the appropriate responses to each. A section where the daub had simply weathered away from the surface could often be repaired by applying new material directly over the sound base. But areas where water penetration had caused the daub to separate from the wattle framework required complete removal and replacement, along with efforts to address the underlying moisture problems that had caused the damage. The wattle framework that was revealed as the damaged daub was removed told its own story of the cottage's construction and the challenges it had faced over the decades. Some of the hazel branches showed signs of insect damage, creating weak points that would need to be reinforced or replaced. In other areas, the wood had remained sound but had shifted slightly as the building settled, creating gaps that would require careful attention during the repair process. Aldrich demonstrated techniques for strengthening damaged wattle without completely rebuilding the framework. New hazel shoots could be woven into the existing structure to provide additional support, but this work required understanding how the new wood would behave as it seasoned and how it would integrate with the older framework. The craftsman had to balance the desire to preserve as much of the original construction as possible with the need to create a sound foundation for the new daub. The preparation of materials for the repair work revealed the complex knowledge required for successful wattle and daub construction. The clay that Aldrich had selected came from a specific location along the riverbank, where decades of experience had shown that the soil had the ideal composition for daub. But this clay could not be used directly from the source. It required careful preparation to remove stones, roots, and other debris that could create weak points in the finished wall. The process of preparing clay began with what medieval builders called weathering, exposing the raw material to several cycles of freezing and thawing that broke down large clumps and created a more uniform texture. Aldrich had begun this process weeks earlier, spreading the clay in thin layers and allowing natural weather conditions to improve its working characteristics. This weathered clay was then mixed with sand in proportions that had been determined through generations of trial and error to provide the optimal balance of workability and durability. The organic binding material for the daub required equally careful selection and preparation. Aldrich preferred to use a combination of chopped straw and animal hair, with the proportions adjusted based on the specific requirements of each repair. Straw provided bulk and helped prevent shrinkage, while animal hair, typically from cattle or horses, provided tensile strength that prevented cracking as the daub dried. The preparation involved cutting the straw to optimal lengths, usually between 2 and 4 inches, and ensuring that the animal hair was clean and free of debris that could cause problems during application. The mixing of the daub required both physical effort and technical expertise. Aldrich, Godwin, and Edmund worked together in a shallow pit that had been prepared near the cottage, combining the clay, sand, and organic materials with carefully controlled amounts of water. The traditional method of mixing by treading ensured thorough combination of all ingredients, while allowing the workers to monitor the consistency of the mixture through the feel of the material under their feet. The proper consistency of daub was something that could only be learned through experience. Too wet, and the material would not hold its shape when applied to vertical surfaces. Too dry, and it would not adhere properly to the wattle framework or spread smoothly during application. Aldrich taught Godwin and Edmund to recognize the correct consistency by the way the material felt underfoot and by its behavior when lifted and squeezed in the hand. The application of the newly mixed daub to the prepared wall sections required techniques that balanced speed with precision. The material had a limited working time before it began to set, but rushing the application could result in poor adhesion or uneven surfaces that would be vulnerable to weather damage. Aldrich demonstrated the proper hand positions and movements for pressing the daub into the spaces between the wattle elements, ensuring complete contact while avoiding the air pockets that could create weak spots. The layering technique was particularly important for larger repairs. Rather than attempting to apply all the necessary material in a single thick layer, Aldrich built up the wall surface in multiple thin coats, allowing each layer to partially set before applying the next. This method ensured better adhesion between layers and reduced the likelihood of cracking as the material dried and cured. As the repair work progressed, Aldrich shared knowledge that went beyond the immediate technical requirements of the task. He explained how different weather conditions affected the curing process and how to modify techniques accordingly. During hot, dry weather, the daub surface might need to be dampened periodically to prevent too rapid drying that could cause cracking. In cool, humid conditions, the material would cure more slowly, requiring patience and careful monitoring to ensure proper hardening. The integration of new daub with existing wall surfaces required particular attention to the edges where new material met old construction. These transition zones were vulnerable to separation and cracking if not properly managed. Aldrich demonstrated techniques for feathering the edges of repairs, creating gradual transitions that distributed stresses evenly and minimized the likelihood of future problems at the repair boundaries. The tools used for finishing the daub surface were often improvised from materials at hand, but their selection and use required considerable skill. Wooden paddles of various sizes allowed the craftsman to smooth large areas and create uniform textures. Pieces of leather or cloth could be used to achieve different surface finishes, from smooth, polished appearances to rougher textures that might be more appropriate for walls that would be covered with whitewash or other protective coatings. The timing of surface finishing work was critical to achieving good results. The daub had to be firm enough to support the pressure of the finishing tools without deforming, but still soft enough to be shaped and smoothed. This window of workability varied depending on weather conditions, the composition of the daub mixture, and the thickness of the applied material. Aldrich had learned to recognize the optimal timing through years of experience, but he also taught Godwin and Edmund the visual and tactile signs that indicated when the material was ready for finishing work. As the day progressed and the major repair areas were completed, Aldrich turned his attention to the smaller maintenance tasks that would help prevent future problems. He demonstrated techniques for sealing minor cracks before they could expand into major damage, showing how small amounts of specially prepared daub could be worked into hairline fissures using simple tools and careful technique. The preventive, maintenance knowledge that Aldrich shared was perhaps as valuable as the major repair techniques. He explained how to identify the early signs of daub deterioration, how to assess whether damage required immediate attention or could wait for more favorable working conditions, and how to prioritize repairs to achieve maximum benefit with limited time and resources. The relationship between the cottage's construction and its immediate environment became a central theme of Aldrich's instruction. Proper drainage around the building was essential for preventing moisture damage to the base of the walls. Vegetation growing too close to the structure could trap moisture and create conditions that promoted deterioration. Even the orientation of the building and the prevailing wind patterns affected how weather impacted different sections of the walls. Godwin and Edmund learned that maintaining a wattle and daub cottage was not simply a matter of repairing damage after it occurred, but of understanding and managing the complex interactions between the building, its environment, and the natural processes of weathering and aging. This knowledge required continuous observation and learning, with each season bringing new insights into how the structure responded to different conditions. The social aspects of construction and repair work also emerged as important themes during the day's activities. Other villagers stopped by to observe the work and share their own experiences with similar repairs. This informal exchange of knowledge was a crucial part of how building techniques were transmitted and improved within rural communities. Each craftsman and householder contributed observations and innovations that gradually refined the collective understanding of how to build and maintain structures in the local environment. As the afternoon light began to fade and the day's work neared completion, Aldrich supervised the application of protective measures that would help the newly repaired sections cure properly. The fresh daub needed protection from rain, direct sunlight, and rapid temperature changes that could cause cracking or poor adhesion. Temporary coverings made from straw mats and wooden boards created sheltered conditions that would allow the material to cure gradually and develop maximum strength. The final task of the day was the preparation of additional repair materials that could be used for future maintenance. Aldrich showed Godwin how to store prepared clay, sand, and organic binding materials in ways that would preserve their working characteristics for months or even years. This stored material would allow the family to respond quickly to minor damage before it could develop into major problems requiring extensive repairs. The knowledge transfer that had occurred during the repair work represented an investment in the long-term sustainability of the cottage and the family's ability to maintain their shelter independently. Godwin and Edmund had learned not just specific techniques, but the underlying principles that would allow them to adapt and improvise when facing new challenges or working with different materials. As darkness settled over the village and the day's work was completed, the cottage stood as testimony to the successful integration of traditional knowledge with individual innovation. The repairs that had been completed would provide years of protection from the weather, but equally important was the knowledge that had been shared and the capabilities that had been developed within the family for ongoing maintenance and improvement. What would the following days reveal about the success of these repairs, and how would the techniques learned during this project influence the family's approach to maintaining their home in the years ahead? The first test of Aldrich's repair work came only 3 days after its completion, when a fierce October storm brought driving rain and howling winds that had damaged roofs and flooded cellars throughout the village of Ashworth. Godwin awoke on the morning after the storm with considerable anxiety, knowing that the fresh daub repairs had not yet had time to cure completely and might have been vulnerable to the severe weather conditions. His examination of the cottage walls in the grey morning light revealed results that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The repaired sections had not only survived the storm intact, but showed no signs of the water penetration that had plagued those areas for years. The careful attention that Aldrich had paid to surface preparation, material selection, and application techniques had created repairs that were actually more weather-resistant than some of the original construction. But the true measure of the repair work's success would become apparent only over the months and years that followed, as the cottage faced the full cycle of seasonal challenges that tested every aspect of its construction. The winter of 1284-1285 proved to be particularly severe, with repeated freeze-thaw cycles that subjected the walls to stresses that could crack or loosen poorly executed repairs. Yet when spring arrived and Godwin conducted his annual assessment of the cottage's condition, the areas that Aldrich had repaired showed no signs of deterioration. More significantly, the knowledge that Godwin and Edmund had gained during the repair project began to influence their approach to maintaining their home throughout the year. They had learned to recognize the early signs of daub deterioration and to address minor problems before they could develop into major damage. This proactive approach to maintenance extended the life of their cottage's construction and reduced the frequency of expensive major repairs. Edmund, who had absorbed the technical lessons with the enthusiasm of youth, began experimenting with variations in daub preparation and application techniques. Working on minor repairs during the spring and summer months, he discovered that certain local materials could supplement or improve upon the traditional ingredients that Aldrich had used. Clay from a different section of the riverbank, when properly prepared, provided superior weather resistance for exposed wall areas. Animal hair from their own livestock, carefully cleaned and prepared, proved as effective as the materials that had to be purchased from other sources. These innovations were not simply random experimentation, but represented the gradual evolution of building techniques that occurred when traditional knowledge was combined with individual observation and creativity. Edmund's discoveries were shared with other young men in the village, contributing to the gradual improvement of local construction, practices that would benefit future generations of builders and householders. The success of the repair project also had economic implications that extended beyond the immediate benefits of improved shelter. A cottage with sound walls and effective weather protection retained its value better than one that showed obvious signs of deterioration. When economic circumstances eventually forced Godwin to consider selling or renting portions of his property, the condition of his cottage became a significant factor in the negotiations. The techniques that Godwin and Edmund had learned also proved valuable in their relationships with neighbors and other community members. Their enhanced understanding of wattle and daub construction made them valuable contributors to collaborative building projects, barn raisings, repairs to community structures, and assistance to families who lacked the skills or resources to maintain their own homes adequately. The knowledge that had been transmitted during Aldrich's repair project became part of the family's permanent inheritance, passed down through subsequent generations along with the cottage itself. When Edmund eventually established his own household, he carried with him not only the specific techniques he had learned, but also the broader understanding of how buildings aged and deteriorated, how to assess and prioritize maintenance needs, and how to balance ideal techniques with practical constraints. The cottage walls themselves became a kind of textbook with different sections displaying various approaches to construction and repair that had been employed over the decades. Edmund's children learned to read these visual lessons, understanding how different materials and techniques had performed under various conditions. This direct, experiential education was often more valuable than formal instruction because it was based on observable results under real-world conditions. The repair project had also demonstrated the importance of timing and patience in construction work. The success of Aldrich's repairs was due in part to his willingness to wait for optimal weather conditions, to prepare materials thoroughly, and to allow adequate curing time for each stage of the work. These lessons influenced Edmund's approach to all kinds of maintenance tasks, helping him understand that rushing to complete work quickly often resulted in inferior results that required additional effort later. The social relationships that had been strengthened during the repair project continued to provide benefits for years afterward. The informal network of knowledge sharing that connected Aldrich with the householders he served created a community of people who understood construction techniques and could provide assistance during emergencies or collaborative projects. This network was particularly valuable during times of economic hardship, when families might not be able to afford professional craftsmen but could still maintain their homes through cooperative effort and shared expertise. The environmental awareness that had been emphasized during the repair work also became a permanent part of the family's approach to managing their property. Godwin and Edmund learned to observe how water moved around their cottage during different weather conditions, how vegetation growth affected moisture levels near the walls, and how seasonal changes influenced the performance of different building materials. This knowledge allowed them to make improvements to drainage, adjust landscaping to protect the structure, and modify their maintenance routines to address seasonal challenges more effectively. The cottage that emerged from Aldrich's repair project was not simply a restored version of its original construction, but a structure that had been improved through the application of accumulated knowledge and individual innovation. The repairs had addressed not only the immediate damage, but also some of the design limitations that had made the original construction vulnerable to certain types of problems. The techniques that had been developed and refined during the project contributed to the broader evolution of wattle and daub construction in the region. Innovations in material preparation, application methods, and protective finishes gradually spread through the network of craftsmen and householders, improving the overall quality and durability of rural construction. The individual project had become part of a larger story of technological and social development that shaped the built environment of medieval England. As years passed and the cottage continued to shelter Godwin's family, and eventually Edmund's descendants, the repairs became indistinguishable from the original construction, integrated seamlessly into the structure's continuing evolution. The knowledge that had been gained during the project became so thoroughly absorbed into the family's practical education that its origins were eventually forgotten, transformed from conscious technique into intuitive understanding. The legacy of Aldrich's work extended far beyond the physical improvements to a single cottage. The knowledge that had been transmitted, the relationships that had been strengthened, and the capabilities that had been developed within the family and community represented investments in resilience and sustainability that would provide benefits for generations. The repair project had demonstrated how traditional knowledge could be preserved and transmitted while also allowing for innovation and improvement based on changing conditions and individual creativity. When Edmund eventually became an old man, watching his own grandchildren learn the techniques of home maintenance and construction, he could see in their eager attention the same hunger for practical knowledge that had driven his own learning decades earlier during Aldrich's repair project. The cycle of knowledge transmission that connected generations of rural families continued, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of building and maintaining homes in the challenging English climate would survive and evolve to meet future needs. The cottage walls that had once told the story of neglect and deterioration now displayed the evidence of continuous care and improvement, a testament to the human capacity for learning, adaptation, and collaboration in the face of practical challenges. The techniques that had saved one family's shelter had become part of the larger story of how ordinary people created and maintained the built environment that sheltered medieval England's rural population, contributing to a tradition of knowledge that would influence construction practices for centuries to come. In the year 1320, when the great manor rolls recorded William de Ashford as a villain holding 2 virgates of land in the village of Millbrook, the climate of England was entering a period of transition that would test the survival skills of rural families for generations to come. William, whom his neighbours called William the Steady for his methodical approach to farming, and his unflappable demeanor in the face of adversity was establishing the patterns of seasonal adaptation that would sustain his descendants through the challenging decades of the Little Ice Age. You might imagine that a medieval peasant's survival strategies were simple matters of luck and endurance, but William's approach to weathering the uncertainties of climate and season demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of resource management, risk assessment, and long-term planning that would have impressed modern agricultural economists. His cottage, newly built on a slight rise overlooking the mill pond, represented not just shelter for his family, but a carefully planned system for surviving the variable conditions that characterized English weather during this period of climatic instability. The construction of William's cottage reflected knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of experience with the challenges of building in a climate where heavy rains could last for weeks, where winter temperatures might drop far below normal expectations, and where sudden storms could damage structures that had weathered decades of ordinary weather. The foundation of the cottage was raised slightly above the surrounding ground level, with drainage channels carefully planned to carry water away from the building during the heavy rains that were becoming increasingly common. The walls, built using the traditional wattle and daub technique, incorporated innovations that William had learned from observing the failures of other buildings during recent severe weather. The daub mixture included a higher proportion of animal hair than was traditionally used, providing additional tensile strength that helped prevent cracking during the freeze-thaw cycles that were becoming more frequent and severe. The thickness of the walls was increased in the areas most exposed to prevailing winds, creating additional insulation and weather resistance where it was most needed. But the true sophistication of William's survival strategies became apparent in his approach to managing the resources that would sustain his family through periods of climatic stress. His farming techniques represented a careful balance between maximizing production during favorable years and maintaining resilience during difficult seasons. Rather than concentrating on a single crop that might provide the highest yields under ideal conditions, William planted diverse varieties of grains and vegetables that would perform differently under various weather conditions. His fields included strips planted with different varieties of wheat, some that performed well in wet years, others that could tolerate drought, and still others that could survive unexpected frosts. This diversification strategy meant that William's harvests were never as large as they might have been if he had concentrated on a single, high-yielding variety, but it also meant that his family never faced complete crop failure, regardless of what weather conditions a particular growing season might bring. The management of livestock reflected similar principles of diversification and risk management. William's animals included not only the cattle and sheep that provided the foundation of his agricultural income, but also pigs that could forage in the woodlands during mast years, chickens that required minimal care while providing steady supplies of eggs and occasional meat, and even a few goats that could browse on vegetation that other animals could not digest. This mixed approach to livestock management provided multiple sources of food and income while reducing the vulnerability that came with dependence on any single type of animal. William's approach to food preservation and storage demonstrated an understanding of the relationship between seasonal abundance and scarcity that guided every aspect of his family's domestic economy. His wife Agnes had been trained by her mother in techniques for preserving food that went far beyond the basic methods known to most peasant families. She understood how to select vegetables at precisely the right stage of ripeness for different preservation methods, how to prepare and maintain the salt brines used for pickling, and how to manage the complex timing required for successful cheese making and meat preservation. The cottage included storage areas that had been specifically designed for different types of preserved foods. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cottage provided the cool, stable temperatures needed for storing root vegetables, hard cheeses, and certain types of preserved meats. An elevated granary built with careful attention to ventilation and pest control protected the family's stores of grain from moisture and rodents. Even the rafters of the cottage were designed to accommodate the hanging and drying of herbs, vegetables, and other foods that required specific combinations of air circulation and protection from direct sunlight. But perhaps most importantly, William had developed systems for monitoring and managing these stored resources that ensured adequate supplies throughout the year while minimizing waste from spoilage. He maintained detailed mental inventories of his family's food stores, calculating consumption rates and adjusting meal planning to ensure that preserved foods were used in the proper sequence to maximize their useful life. This knowledge allowed him to make informed decisions about when to supplement their diet with purchased foods, when to share surplus resources with neighbors, and when to begin rationing in preparation for difficult periods. The seasonal rhythm of William's survival strategies reflected a deep understanding of the relationship between weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and the availability of different types of resources. His spring activities focused not only on planting crops but also on gathering wild foods that could supplement the family's diet during the lean months before the harvest. Agnes and their children learned to identify and collect the edible plants that emerged as winter ended, young nettle shoots, wild garlic, early greens that provided essential nutrition after months of dependence on preserved foods. Summer work included not only the intensive labor of tending crops and livestock, but also the collection and preparation of materials that would be needed during the autumn and winter months. William spent considerable time during the summer months gathering and preparing fuel for the coming winter, understanding that adequate heating would be essential not only for comfort, but for food preparation and preservation activities that would continue throughout the cold months. The autumn harvest season represented the culmination of the year's agricultural work, but also the beginning of the most critical period for ensuring the family's survival through the winter months ahead. William's approach to harvest timing reflected sophisticated understanding of how weather conditions affected both crop yields and the success of preservation activities. He learned to balance the desire to maximize yields by allowing crops to fully ripen with the need to complete harvesting before autumn storms could damage or destroy the year's production. The allocation of harvested crops between immediate consumption, preservation for winter use, and seed for the following year's planting required careful calculation and considerable discipline. William understood that decisions made during the harvest weeks would determine not only whether his family survived the coming winter, but also whether they would have adequate resources for successful farming in the following year. This long-term perspective influenced every aspect of his resource management, creating a cycle of sustainability that could weather individual years of poor harvests without compromising the family's long-term viability. Winter activities in William's household continued the pattern of careful resource management, while also providing opportunities for maintaining and improving the tools, equipment, and skills that would be needed for successful farming in the following year. William used the indoor time of winter months for repairing and creating the wooden tools, leather goods, and textile materials that were essential for agricultural work. Agnes and the children continued food processing activities, grinding grain, spinning wool, preparing medicines from dried herbs that contributed to the family's self-sufficiency while also providing products that could be traded for resources. The family could not produce themselves. The social aspects of William's survival strategies were as important as the technical and economic considerations. His approach to community relationships balanced self-reliance with recognition that individual families could not survive completely independently during times of crisis. William participated in cooperative work arrangements that allowed families to share labor during peak agricultural periods, reducing the risk that any single family would be unable to complete essential tasks due to illness, injury, or other unforeseen circumstances. His reputation for steady reliability and sound judgment made him a valued participant in the informal networks of mutual assistance that connected the families of Millbrook. During years when his own harvests were abundant, William shared surplus resources with neighbors who had been less fortunate. During difficult years, he could count on similar assistance from families whose preparations had been more successful. This social dimension of survival created a form of insurance that protected individual families while strengthening the resilience of the entire community. The knowledge and techniques that William developed during his lifetime were carefully transmitted to his children, ensuring that the family's accumulated expertise would be preserved and continue to evolve in response to changing conditions. His son Robert learned not only the specific techniques of farming and resource management, but also the underlying principles that allowed these techniques to be adapted and modified as circumstances required. William's daughter Mary absorbed the complex domestic skills that her mother Agnes had mastered, but she also learned to innovate and experiment with new approaches to food preservation, household management, and the other activities that were essential for maintaining a peasant household. The knowledge that was transmitted within William's family was not simply a collection of fixed techniques, but a dynamic system of understanding that could respond to new challenges and opportunities. As William aged and began to transfer primary responsibility for the family's welfare to the next generation, he could look back on decades of successful adaptation to the variable and often challenging conditions that characterized the climate of early 14th century England. His cottage had weathered storms that had damaged other buildings. His fields had continued to produce crops during seasons when other families faced hunger, and his family had not only survived but prospered despite the uncertainties of the transitional climate period. The foundation that William established, the physical infrastructure of cottage and fields, the accumulated stores of preserved foods and essential materials, the social relationships that connected his family to the broader community, and most importantly, the knowledge and skills that would allow future generations to continue adapting to changing conditions, would prove essential as England's climate continued to evolve toward the more challenging conditions of the Little Ice Age. What lessons would William's son Robert learn from his father's example, and how would he adapt these survival strategies to meet the different challenges of his own generation? Robert de Ashford inherited more than his father's cottage and landholding when William the Steady passed away in the harsh winter of 1348. He inherited a legacy of methodical preparation and adaptive thinking that would prove essential as England's climate continued its relentless slide toward the depths of the Little Ice Age. But Robert, whom the villagers came to call Robert the Innovator, for his willingness to experiment with new techniques and modifications to traditional practices, faced challenges that his father's generation could hardly have imagined. The winter of 1348 to 1349, which claimed William's life along with nearly a third of Millbrook's population, marked a turning point in both the demographic and climatic history of medieval England. The Black Death had fundamentally altered the social and economic structure of rural communities, while the continuing deterioration of the climate created agricultural and survival challenges that required new approaches to problems that previous generations had managed with traditional methods. Robert's first innovation involved modifications to the cottage that his father had built with such care. The increasingly severe winters demanded better insulation and more efficient heating systems than the original construction provided. Working with knowledge gained from careful observation of which areas of the cottage lost heat most rapidly, and which modifications other families had attempted with varying degrees of success, Robert developed techniques for improving the building's thermal performance without compromising its structural integrity. The most significant of these modifications involved the creation of what amounted to a double wall system in the areas of the cottage most exposed to winter winds. Robert constructed an additional layer of wattle and daub approximately 6 inches outside the original wall, creating an insulating airspace that dramatically reduced heat loss during the coldest months. This technique required careful attention to ventilation and moisture management to prevent condensation problems, but the results were remarkable in terms of improved comfort and reduced fuel consumption. Robert also modified the cottage's heating system, developing innovations that increased the efficiency of their fuel use while providing better heat distribution throughout the living space. Rather than relying solely on the traditional central hearth, he created a series of smaller heating areas that could be used selectively depending on the family's activities and the severity of the weather. This system allowed them to heat only the portions of the cottage that were being used, conserving fuel while maintaining adequate warmth for essential activities. But Robert's most significant innovations involved his approach to food production and preservation in the face of increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. The growing seasons were becoming shorter and more variable, with late frosts that could destroy crops that had survived similar conditions in previous generations, and early autumn freezes that cut short the growing period for vegetables that had traditionally provided important nutrition during the winter months. Robert's response to these challenges involved both modifications to existing agricultural practices and the development of entirely new approaches to food production. He began experimenting with protected cultivation techniques that allowed him to extend the growing season for certain crops despite the deteriorating climate. Using temporary structures made from woven reed mats and animal skins, he created microclimates that protected vulnerable plants from frost and wind while capturing and concentrating available solar heat. These early greenhouse techniques were rudimentary by modern standards, but they represented sophisticated understanding of how environmental conditions affected plant growth and how those conditions could be modified using available materials and technologies. Robert's protected beds allowed him to continue harvesting fresh vegetables weeks after outdoor crops had been killed by frost, providing essential nutrition during the critical transition period between the end of the growing season and the beginning of winter's dependence on preserved foods. The preservation techniques that Robert developed built upon the foundation established by his parents, but incorporated innovations that addressed the specific challenges created by the changing climate. Longer, more severe winters required food preservation methods that could maintain nutritional value and prevent spoilage for extended periods that stretched the limits of traditional techniques. Robert experimented with combination preservation, methods that used multiple techniques simultaneously to achieve better results than any single method could provide. Vegetables might be partially dried to remove excess moisture, then pickled in carefully prepared brines, and finally stored in controlled environments that maintained optimal temperature and humidity conditions. These multi-stage processes required more labor and resources than traditional preservation methods, but they produced preserved foods that maintained better quality and nutritional value throughout the extended storage periods that the deteriorating climate demanded. The management of livestock during increasingly severe winters required innovations that went beyond the traditional practices that had served previous generations adequately. Robert developed techniques for providing shelter and nutrition for animals during weather conditions that were beyond the normal range of variability that traditional animal husbandry practices had been designed to handle. His innovations included improved barn construction that provided better protection from wind and precipitation while maintaining adequate ventilation to prevent the moisture problems that could lead to respiratory diseases in confined animals. He also developed techniques for preserving and storing animal fodder that maintain nutritional value throughout longer winter feeding periods, ensuring that livestock could maintain their health and productivity despite the extended periods when natural forage was unavailable. Robert's approach to fuel management represented another area where innovation was essential for adapting to the changing climate. The longer, more severe winters required larger quantities of fuel than traditional. Collection and storage methods could reliably provide. The increasing frequency of severe storms also made it more difficult to gather fuel during the winter months, requiring better planning and more extensive storage facilities. Robert developed techniques for identifying and harvesting alternative fuel sources that could supplement traditional wood supplies during periods of scarcity. He learned to prepare and use agricultural residues, crop stubble, pruned branches from fruit trees, even carefully selected weeds and wild plants, as fuel sources that could extend their supplies of conventional wood during the coldest months. His storage innovations included techniques for seasoning and protecting fuel supplies that ensured better burning characteristics and prevented the moisture problems that could make fuel supplies unusable during critical periods. These techniques required additional labor during the autumn preparation period, but they provided insurance against fuel shortages that could be life-threatening during severe winter weather. The social aspects of Robert's survival strategies reflected the changed circumstances that resulted from both the demographic impact of the plague and the increasing severity of climate challenges. With fewer families remaining in Millbrook, the traditional networks of mutual assistance had to be restructured to provide adequate support for the reduced population while managing resources that were increasingly stretched by the demands of survival in a deteriorating climate. Robert played a leading role in developing new forms of community cooperation that addressed these challenges. He helped organize collaborative projects that allowed families to share the labor and resources required for major improvements to cottage construction, fuel gathering, and food preservation activities. These cooperative arrangements allowed individual families to undertake improvements that would have been impossible with their own resources while creating systems of mutual support that provided security during emergencies. The knowledge transmission that occurred within Robert's family reflected his recognition that the survival techniques that had served his father's generation were no longer adequate for the challenges that his children would face. His son Thomas learned not only the traditional skills of farming and resource management, but also the experimental methods and innovative thinking that allowed established techniques to be modified and improved in response to changing conditions. Robert's daughter Elizabeth absorbed both the domestic skills that her grandmother Agnes had mastered and the new techniques that her mother had developed for managing household resources under increasingly challenging conditions. But she also learned the principles of observation, experimentation, and adaptation that allowed these techniques to continue evolving as circumstances required. The cottage that Robert passed on to the next generation was a substantially different structure from the one his father had built, modified, and improved through decades of systematic enhancement that addressed the specific challenges posed by the deteriorating climate. The agricultural practices associated with the family's landholding had similarly evolved, incorporating innovations that maintain productivity despite shorter growing seasons and more variable weather conditions. But perhaps most importantly, Robert left his descendants a legacy of adaptive thinking and experimental approach to problem solving that would prove essential as the climate continued to deteriorate toward the depths of the Little Ice Age. The techniques he had developed were not simply solutions to specific problems, but examples of how traditional knowledge could be modified and improved to meet new challenges. The innovations that Robert introduced improved cottage construction, extended food preservation techniques, protected cultivation methods, and enhanced fuel management systems would become the foundation for further developments as his descendants faced even more severe challenges during the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age. How would Robert's son Thomas build upon this foundation of innovation to address the unprecedented challenges that awaited during the deepest cold of the 14th and 15th centuries, and what new techniques would be required as the climate reached its most challenging phase? Thomas de Ashford who inherited the family cottage and landholding in 1389, faced climate conditions that would have been unimaginable to his grandfather William the Steady. The Little Ice Age had reached its full intensity, bringing winters so severe that even experienced survivors struggled to adapt their traditional techniques to the unprecedented challenges. Yet Thomas, whom his neighbors called Thomas the Endurer for his stubborn refusal to be defeated by even the harshest conditions, not only survived but established the foundation for techniques that would sustain his family through the worst climatic period in recorded English history. The winter of 1390-1391 introduced Thomas to the reality of conditions that his father Robert's innovations had anticipated but never fully experienced. Temperatures dropped so low that wine froze solid in storage containers, and the village pond remained frozen from November through March with ice thick enough to support loaded carts. The carefully planned food preservation techniques that had seemed adequate for previous winters proved barely sufficient for the extended cold periods that now characterized the winter season. Thomas's response to these extreme conditions demonstrated the progression of adaptive knowledge through the generations. Building upon his father's innovations in cottage construction and resource management, he developed techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with medieval technology and materials. His modifications to the family cottage created what amounted to a survival shelter that could maintain livable conditions even during the most severe weather. The heating innovations that Thomas developed represented sophisticated understanding of heat transfer and conservation principles. He modified the cottage's interior to create distinct thermal zones with heavily insulated sleeping areas that could be heated efficiently with minimal fuel consumption, and larger work areas that could be warmed during the day when activities required more space and light. The system included techniques for capturing and storing heat during the warmest parts of the day, using heated stones and other thermal mass materials to extend the period when the cottage remained comfortable. Thomas also developed techniques for managing indoor air quality during the extended periods when the cottage had to remain sealed against extreme outdoor conditions. The traditional approach of simply tolerating smoky, stuffy interiors during cold weather was inadequate for the weeks-long periods of confinement that severe Little Ice Age winters demanded. His innovations included improved ventilation systems that allowed fresh air circulation without excessive heat loss, and methods for managing moisture and preventing the condensation problems that could make indoor conditions unhealthy. The food preservation and management techniques that Thomas refined represented the culmination of 3 generations of innovation and adaptation. His methods for storing and rationing preserved foods ensured adequate nutrition throughout winter periods that stretched far beyond the duration that traditional preservation techniques had been designed to handle. He developed techniques for extending the storage life of preserved foods through careful environmental control and improved container design. Thomas's innovations in protected cultivation represented significant advances beyond his father's experimental techniques. His protected growing areas included partially underground structures that took advantage of the Earth's insulation while capturing available solar heat through carefully designed openings and heat trap systems. These installations allowed him to produce fresh vegetables throughout much of the winter, providing essential nutrition that supplemented preserved foods and helped prevent the nutritional deficiencies that could be fatal during extended cold periods. The agricultural techniques that Thomas developed for the changed climatic conditions included modifications to crop selection and timing that maximized productivity despite shorter growing seasons and more frequent crop failures due to weather extremes. His approach included extensive use of cold-resistant crop varieties and innovative techniques for protecting growing crops from unexpected frosts and storms. Thomas's livestock management innovations included techniques for maintaining animal health and productivity during extended winter feeding periods that pushed the limits of traditional animal husbandry practices. His methods for providing adequate shelter, nutrition, and healthcare for livestock during extreme weather conditions ensured that the family's animals not only survived but continued to provide milk, eggs, and other products throughout the worst winter months. The social aspects of survival during this period required new forms of community cooperation that went beyond the mutual assistance networks that had served previous generations. Thomas played a central role in developing collaborative survival strategies that allowed the reduced population of Millbrook to maintain essential community functions despite the extreme challenges posed by the climate. These collaborative arrangements included shared construction projects that created community resources, improved grain storage facilities, shared workshops for tool maintenance and construction, communal areas for food processing activities that were more efficient when performed on a larger scale. The community also developed systems for sharing knowledge and techniques that ensured innovations developed by individual families were transmitted to others who could benefit from them. Thomas's approach to knowledge transmission reflected his understanding that the survival techniques required for Little Ice Age conditions were becoming so complex and specialized that they required systematic education and practice to master effectively. His son Robert, named for his grandfather, learned not only the specific techniques but also the principles of systematic observation, experimentation, and adaptation that allowed survival strategies to continue evolving as conditions changed. But it was Thomas's daughter Margaret, who would come to be known as Margaret the Wise, who most fully embodied the accumulated knowledge of 4 generations of climate adaptation. Born during the harsh winter of 1395, Margaret grew up during the worst climatic conditions that England would experience during the medieval period, developing survival skills and adaptive thinking that represented the pinnacle of peasant resourcefulness and innovation. Margaret's childhood education included not only the traditional domestic skills expected of peasant women, but also comprehensive training in the complex technical knowledge that her family had developed for surviving extreme conditions. By the age of 12, she could assess the condition of preserved foods with the expertise of someone twice her age, identifying the subtle signs that indicated when items needed to be consumed quickly or when storage conditions needed to be adjusted to prevent spoilage. Her understanding of cottage maintenance and modification exceeded that of many adult men in the village. Margaret could identify structural problems, plan and execute repairs using available materials, and design improvements that enhanced the building's performance under extreme weather conditions. This knowledge proved essential when she married Edmund the Miller's son in 1414 and established her own household during a period when skilled craftsmen were scarce and expensive. Margaret's innovations in food production and preservation represented the culmination of nearly a century of adaptive development within her family. Her techniques for protected cultivation produced fresh vegetables throughout the winter months, using installations that were far more sophisticated than her grandfather Robert's experimental structures. Her preservation methods maintained food quality and nutritional value for storage periods that extended well beyond what traditional techniques could achieve. The domestic economy that Margaret established in her own household demonstrated how the accumulated knowledge of previous generations could be integrated into comprehensive survival systems that addressed all aspects of peasant life. Her methods for managing household resources, planning seasonal activities, and coordinating the complex interactions between agricultural production, food preservation, fuel management, and shelter maintenance created a model of sustainability that influenced other families throughout the region. Margaret's approach to community leadership reflected her understanding that individual survival was ultimately dependent on community resilience. She played central roles in organizing collaborative projects that created shared resources and distributed essential knowledge throughout the village population. Her teaching and mentoring activities ensured that the survival techniques developed by her family were preserved and transmitted to younger generations who would face continued climatic challenges. The techniques that Margaret refined during the 1420s and 1430s represented the highest development of medieval peasant survival technology. Her methods for managing complex multi-crop agricultural systems, sophisticated food preservation and storage techniques, advanced cottage construction and heating systems, and comprehensive resource management strategies created a survival package that could sustain families through the most extreme conditions that the Little Ice Age could produce. But perhaps Margaret's most important contribution was her systematic approach to knowledge preservation and transmission. Understanding that the complex techniques required for surviving extreme climatic conditions could be lost if they were not carefully preserved and taught, she developed formal educational programs that ensured essential knowledge would be transmitted to future generations regardless of individual family circumstances. Margaret's children learned not only the specific techniques but also the underlying principles of observation, analysis, and adaptation that allowed survival strategies to continue evolving. Her systematic approach to education created a generation of young adults who understood not only how to survive extreme conditions, but also how to develop new techniques and improvements as circumstances required. The cottage that Margaret and Edmund inhabited by the 1440s represented the accumulated improvements of 4 generations of adaptive construction. The structure incorporated innovations in insulation, heating, ventilation, and environmental control that created living conditions that were comfortable and healthy even during the most severe weather. The associated buildings, storage facilities, workshops, protected growing areas formed a comprehensive survival complex that could sustain the family independently for extended periods. The agricultural practices associated with the family's landholding had similarly evolved through 4 generations of adaptation to changing climatic conditions. The techniques for crop selection, soil management, pest control, and harvest timing had been refined to maximize productivity and minimize risk under the variable and often extreme weather conditions that characterized the Little Ice Age. As Margaret aged and began transferring responsibility to her own children during the 1450s and 1460s, she could see signs that the climate was beginning to moderate slightly from the extreme conditions of her youth. The winters were still severe by historical standards, but the absolute depths of cold that had characterized the early 15th century were becoming less frequent. Her approach to preparing the next generation reflected this recognition that conditions were likely to continue changing, requiring continued adaptation and innovation. Margaret's children learned not only the specific techniques that had proven successful during the worst climatic conditions, but also the methods for modifying and adapting these techniques as circumstances changed. The knowledge that Margaret preserved and transmitted included not only practical techniques, but also the accumulated wisdom about human adaptation, community cooperation, and the psychological and social factors that determined whether families and communities survived or failed during periods of extreme stress. This knowledge would prove essential as England gradually emerged from the Little Ice Age, and peasant families had to adapt their survival strategies to new conditions that required different approaches to familiar challenges. The legacy of 4 generations of climate adaptation represented in Margaret's accumulated knowledge included sophisticated understanding of the relationships between weather patterns, agricultural productivity, resource management, and community cooperation. The techniques that had been developed through decades of innovation and refinement created a comprehensive approach to survival that addressed all aspects of peasant life under challenging conditions. The cottage and landholding that Margaret eventually passed to her descendants included not only the physical infrastructure that had been improved through generations of modification, but also the accumulated knowledge, social relationships, and adaptive capabilities that had made survival possible during the most challenging climatic period in English history. As the worst conditions of the Little Ice Age gradually moderated during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the descendants of William the Steady possessed the knowledge and capabilities needed to adapt once again to changing conditions. The survival techniques that had been developed for extreme conditions could be modified and applied to new circumstances, ensuring that the family's accumulated expertise would continue to provide benefits regardless of what future climatic challenges might emerge. The story of 4 generations of climate adaptation in Millbrook demonstrated the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to develop sophisticated responses to environmental challenges that threatened their survival. The techniques that had been developed through systematic observation, experimentation, and innovation represented achievements in sustainable living that rivaled the accomplishments of professional engineers and scientists working with modern technology and resources. The knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted through the family's educational traditions ensured that the accumulated wisdom of successful adaptation would be available to help future generations face whatever challenges the changing climate might bring. The legacy of William the Steady, Robert the Innovator, Thomas the Endurer, and Margaret the Wise lived on in the techniques, attitudes, and capabilities that would guide their descendants through centuries of continued adaptation to the variable and challenging conditions of English rural life. As we reach the end of these 4 interconnected stories spanning nearly 2 centuries of English peasant life, you have witnessed the remarkable ingenuity and resilience that allowed ordinary families to survive and thrive during one of the most challenging climatic periods in recorded history. From Agnes and William's desperate struggle through the winter of 1363 to the Tudor Hartwell's sophisticated preservation techniques, from Aldrich's masterful repair work to 4 generations of the de Ashford family's continuous adaptation, these tales reveal the extraordinary resourcefulness that lay hidden beneath the surface of what we might consider boring history. The techniques of survival that emerged from these stories, the careful layering of clothing and bedding, the ingenious methods of food preservation, the sophisticated understanding of building materials and construction techniques, the complex social networks that supported individual families during times of crisis, represent achievements in sustainable living that continue to offer lessons for our modern world. These were not simple people living simple lives, but individuals who developed complex solutions to challenging problems using limited resources and traditional knowledge. Their stories remind us that human adaptability and innovation have always been the keys to survival, and that the accumulated wisdom of those who came before us contains insights that remain valuable centuries later. The boring details of medieval life, the precise timing of grain harvests, the careful calculation of fuel requirements, the systematic approach to maintaining cottage walls, the intricate social arrangements that supported community survival, reveal themselves to be anything but boring when we understand them as solutions to the fundamental challenge of staying alive in a world where small mistakes could have fatal consequences. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine the steady dripping of water through ancient thatch, the crackling of carefully banked fires, the quiet satisfaction of families who had prepared well for whatever challenges the seasons might bring. In their patient endurance and creative adaptation, these long-forgotten peasants left us a legacy of knowledge about the art of survival that transcends the specific challenges they faced, offering timeless lessons about resilience, community, and the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to overcome extraordinary obstacles.